If you walk away now, you'll never know what could have been, whispered Lila Bennett as she stumbled through the mist-laden forest, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth, leaves slick beneath her fingers. The moon hung low, spilling silver across the twisted roots and mossy rocks, illuminating the narrow path she barely recognized. Her heart pounded, not from the chill in the air, but from the echo of ridicule that still clung to her from the packs gathering hours before. They had laughed, whispered, pointed, and made her feel like a shadow among the living, a mistake born under the wrong moon. She pressed herself against the trunk of an ancient oak, inhaling the sharp scent of pine and wet soil, trying to steady her shaking hands. Somewhere ahead, a soft, uneven whimper caught her ear, slicing through the night's stillness. Lila froze, her instincts screaming both caution and curiosity, and then she heard it again, closer, more desperate, and without thinking, she followed the sound. Every step carried the memory of being unseen, unworthy, the pack's cruel words etched into her memory, yet she could not ignore the tiny voice calling for help. Through the tangle of ferns and twisted roots, she found him, a wolf unlike any she had ever seen. His coat was thick but matted with dew and leaves, and his eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the moonlight with an intelligence that made her heart constrict. The whimpers were small, pained, and fragile, and she instinctively dropped to her knees, extending her hands as if she could draw the creature's pain into herself. She whispered, "It's okay. I'm here." And for a moment, the forest held its breath with her. The wind stilled, the leaves ceased their rustle, and even the distant owl seemed to wait. As she gently brushed away the debris from his fur, the wolf flinched, but there was no anger, only fear and fatigue, and Lila felt a strange warmth bloom in her chest, a tingling that ran from her fingertips up her arms. She had never known such a sensation before, but she did not hesitate, pressing her palms against his side, murmuring encouragements in the hush of the midnight air. Somewhere high above, the moonlight seemed to respond, catching on the edges of his fur, casting silver lines that shimmered and shifted like liquid. She sensed an unspoken connection, a bond forming in the quiet, charged moment, and though the forest still held shadows and unseen dangers, she did not retreat. Footsteps echoed softly behind her, but she did not turn. Her focus was solely on the small, trembling creature in front of her, whose chest rose and fell unevenly. The warmth spread, the tingling intensified, and a gentle hum seemed to vibrate through her hands, a whisper of life restoring itself in a rhythm that matched her own heartbeat. The wolf's eyes blinked, pupils dilating as if in recognition, and Lila realized with a shock that her own breath had synchronized with his shallow inhalations. She felt both awe and fear, but mostly an overwhelming sense that she was exactly where she needed to be, that this small, fragile being was part of something greater she could not yet name. From the shadows of the towering pines, a figure watched, tall and imposing, his presence commanding yet calm, eyes reflecting a depth that made Lila's pulse leap. She did not know him yet, but instinctively felt the weight of destiny pressing around them, an invisible tether linking her to the watcher, the wolf, and the unfolding night, and for the first time in her life, the fear of being unseen, rejected, and small melted into the focus of purpose, a quiet, unshakable drive to protect, to care, and to answer the call that only she could hear. The silence that followed felt heavier than the wind itself, as if the forest had leaned in to witness what Lila Bennett was doing without fully understanding it. Her hands remained gently pressed against the injured wolf, though the strange warmth beneath her palms had begun to soften into a steady, calming pulse rather than the sudden surge she had felt moments before. The creature's breathing, once uneven and fragile, now carried a faint rhythm that matched the quiet cadence of her own heartbeat. Lila did not move away, even as doubt crept into the edges of her thoughts like fog sliding between trees. She had been told all her life that she was ordinary, that she should not expect anything extraordinary from herself, yet nothing about this moment felt ordinary. The forest around her seemed different now, less like a place of danger and more like a living presence that was holding its breath with her. A distant branch snapped, and her shoulders tensed, but she did not withdraw her hands. Instead, she slowly lifted her gaze, scanning the darkness between the towering pines. That was when she sensed it again. The same presence she had felt earlier, not seen but deeply felt, like pressure in the air before a storm breaks. Somewhere beyond the veil of shadows stood someone watching her with unwavering focus. Her instinct told her not to be afraid, yet her upbringing told her otherwise, and for a moment those two truths warred within her chest. The wolf beneath her fingers shifted slightly, a small movement that grounded her back into the present, reminding her why she was here at all. She lowered her head again, whispering softly as if the words themselves could weave reassurance into the air. "You are safe now," she said, though she did not know if she was speaking to the creature, to herself, or to whatever unseen force lingered in the trees. The glow of moonlight shifted overhead, sliding through the canopy in broken patterns that made the forest floor shimmer like scattered glass. Then, faintly, she heard footsteps that were not hurried but deliberate, controlled, and impossibly calm. They did not approach quickly, yet each step felt closer than it should have, as though distance meant nothing to the one walking. Lila's breath caught slightly, but she forced herself to remain still, trusting something deeper than fear. The unseen watcher had not yet revealed himself, but his presence now felt undeniable, like gravity pulling at the edges of her awareness. The injured wolf let out a soft sound, no longer a whimper, but something closer to calm recognition, and Lila felt a subtle shift beneath her hands, as if whatever damage had bound the creature was no longer holding it in place. Her fingers trembled slightly as she realized the warmth was not fading but stabilizing, becoming a quiet but constant flow. She had no words for what was happening, only the growing sense that she had stepped into a story far larger than herself. Behind the trees, the figure finally stopped moving, and though she still could not see him clearly, she could feel his gaze settle upon her with an intensity that did not judge but observe with silent certainty. Lila swallowed once, steadying herself, and for the first time since she entered the forest, she did not feel like she was being watched as prey, but as something far more significant, something chosen by circumstances she did not yet understand. The forest remained still, waiting, as if the next breath would decide everything that followed. The stillness stretched across the forest like an unseen veil, holding every sound in suspension as if the world itself was waiting for permission to continue. Lila Bennett remained kneeling in the soft earth, her hands still resting on the injured wolf, though the warmth beneath her palms had now become a steady and grounding presence rather than something unpredictable. Her breathing had slowed, but her awareness had sharpened, every instinct inside her alert to the presence she could feel beyond the trees. The sensation was not fear exactly, but something deeper, something that made her feel as though she stood at the edge of a truth she had never been meant to see. Slowly, she lifted her head again, her eyes scanning the dense line of pines where the darkness gathered in thick layers. The presence that watched her did not move, yet it pressed into the space around her with undeniable weight, as though the air itself belonged to it. The wolf beneath her hands shifted slightly again, this time more steadily, and Lila felt a subtle change ripple through its body, like tension dissolving into something calmer and more stable. She exhaled softly, her fingers instinctively adjusting their position as if guided by something beyond thought. The forest responded with a faint rustle, leaves moving without wind, branches bending in ways that felt intentional rather than random. Then, from the shadowed edge of the trees, the figure finally stepped forward. He did not emerge quickly or with urgency, but with a quiet certainty that made every small sound feel deliberate. Tall and composed, he moved with a controlled stillness that suggested strength held carefully in place rather than displayed. His presence was not loud, yet it filled the clearing in a way that made distance feel irrelevant. Lila felt her breath catch slightly, though she did not pull away. Instead, she studied him with cautious attention, noticing the way his gaze remained fixed not on the wolf alone, but on her hands, on the connection she seemed to have formed without understanding how. The air around him carried an intensity that made her heartbeat quicken, not from alarm, but from the strange sense that nothing about this moment was accidental. The injured wolf let out a low, steady sound, no longer distressed, and Lila felt the warmth beneath her palms deepen once more, as though responding to the silent presence that had now revealed itself. The man stopped several steps away, his posture still and controlled, his expression unreadable in the dim silver light. Lila did not speak at first, uncertain whether words would break something fragile in the atmosphere that surrounded them. Instead, she simply held her ground, her hands steady, her focus divided between the recovering creature and the stranger who seemed to understand more than he revealed. The forest seemed to narrow around them, every sound fading until only the quiet rhythm of breath and awareness remained. Lila finally spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, asking nothing specific, only acknowledging what could no longer be ignored. The man did not answer immediately, but something in his gaze shifted, subtle and deliberate, as if confirming a thought he had already begun to form. The moment stretched, heavy yet strangely calm, and Lila realized that whatever had brought her here was no longer just about the wounded creature, but about something far larger, something that had begun unfolding long before she ever entered the forest. The man remained still for a moment that felt longer than it should have, as if time itself was adjusting to his presence in the clearing. Lila Bennett kept her hands steady on the injured wolf, though her attention was now divided between the creature and the stranger standing only a few steps away. His silence was not empty. It carried intention, measured and calm, like someone who had learned long ago that words were not always necessary to be understood. The forest around them seemed to soften, the rustling leaves settling into an uneasy quiet that felt almost respectful. Lila finally broke the silence with a careful breath, her voice quiet but steady as she asked if he had come from nearby, though even as she spoke, she sensed that the answer would not be simple. The man's gaze shifted slightly, not away from her, but toward the wolf beneath her hands, as if acknowledging the connection she had formed with it. When he spoke, his voice was low and controlled, carrying a tone that did not demand attention but naturally held it. He told her that the creature she was tending was not what it appeared to be, though he did not elaborate further, and instead studied her reaction with quiet precision. Lila felt a flicker of confusion rise within her, but it was not fear that followed, only a deeper curiosity that anchored her in place. She glanced down at the wolf again, noticing how its breathing had grown more stable, the earlier tension in its body now replaced with a faint but steady rhythm. The warmth beneath her hands had not faded. Instead, it had become something almost natural, as if it belonged there. The man stepped slightly closer, still maintaining a respectful distance, and for the first time Lila noticed the subtle details in his expression, the way his eyes reflected both recognition and restraint. He asked her if she had ever experienced something like this before, gesturing faintly toward her hands, and Lila hesitated, unsure how to answer something she did not understand herself. She admitted softly that she had not, that everything about this moment felt unfamiliar, yet strangely right, as if something inside her had been waiting without her knowledge. The man's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, then shifted briefly toward the surrounding forest, as if sensing something beyond what she could perceive. The air grew still again, heavier now, not with danger, but with anticipation. Lila felt it too, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that suggested the world beyond the clearing was not as distant as it seemed. The wolf exhaled more deeply, its body relaxing further beneath her touch, and she realized that whatever had been broken in it was no longer holding power over it. The man finally spoke again, this time with a quieter tone, as if confirming a truth he had already accepted. He told her that she had done something rare, something that should not have been possible without training or knowledge, yet she had done it instinctively. Lila looked at her hands as if seeing them for the first time, uncertainty and wonder mingling in her expression. The forest remained still, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt like the beginning of something unfolding, something that neither of them had fully stepped into yet, but both were now undeniably part of. The forest seemed to hold its breath as Lila Bennett continued to cradle the wolf, the faint warmth beneath her hands now a constant pulse that mirrored her own heartbeat. She sensed the quiet presence of the man watching her from the shadows, the steady weight of his attention like gravity, pulling her awareness outward. The wolf lifted its head slightly, ears twitching at the soft, distant rustle of leaves, and Lila instinctively adjusted her posture to protect and comfort it, murmuring words she did not know the meaning of but felt were necessary. Each word carried a rhythm, a quiet resonance that seemed to calm not just the creature, but the air itself around them. The moonlight filtered through the canopy above, creating slivers of silver that traced along the contours of the clearing, highlighting every movement, every shift of breath, every pulse of life that connected them all. Lila's mind was alert, focused entirely on the creature beneath her hands, and the subtle currents of energy she could feel moving through the clearing. She noticed now the tiniest details, the way the dew clung to the moss, how the shadows shifted imperceptibly with the movements of the unseen figure, and how the air seemed to carry a faint vibration that resonated with the rhythm of the wolf's steadying heartbeat. The man stepped forward slightly, and this time Lila felt the pull of his gaze more keenly, not as an intrusion, but as recognition, a silent acknowledgement that she had done what no one else had dared. A subtle shiver of awareness ran through her, and she realized she had felt this presence all along, a tether she could not name, linking her to something vast, something larger than herself. The wolf lifted its head fully, eyes reflecting the pale moonlight, no longer fearful, no longer trembling, but calm, as if sensing it was finally safe. Lila allowed herself to breathe more fully, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly, though her senses remained sharpened, aware of every sound and shadow. She felt an instinctual pull, not a command, but a gentle urging to rise and meet the presence before her, to recognize the significance of this moment not just for herself, but for the creature she had nurtured. Slowly, she lifted her gaze and met the eyes of the man, catching the faintest hint of surprise that crossed his features as he regarded the wolf beside her, now noticeably steadier. The danger that had seemed so immediate now diffused into a quiet calm. A subtle understanding passed between them, silent and profound, that what had been accomplished was more than simple care. It was a bond, an unspoken connection that bridged their separate experiences in the clearing. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, intertwining with something else, an intangible thread that connected the three of them in a way neither fully understood, yet both recognized as important. Lila felt the edges of her awareness expand, a sense of presence and purpose growing in her chest, a quiet determination that she was exactly where she needed to be, and the forest, the wolf, and the silent observer all seemed to acknowledge it in turn, holding the space around them still, expectant, and poised on the cusp of the next revelation. The subtle tension in the clearing seemed to shift as the night deepened, the moon rising higher and casting a gentle silver glow over the forest floor, highlighting the soft sheen of dew on the leaves and the faint shimmer of moss along the tree trunks. Lila Bennett felt a quiet stirring within her, a sensation that had grown steadily since the moment she first touched the injured wolf. It was not fear, but a sense of purpose, a pulse of energy that seemed to flow from her hands through her arms and into her chest, anchoring her entirely to the present. The wolf, now more steady on its legs, lifted its head fully, amber eyes meeting hers with an almost knowing gaze, as if acknowledging that trust had been established and that the bond between them was growing stronger with every heartbeat. From the shadows, the man who had been watching remained still, his posture upright yet relaxed, his eyes reflecting the soft light in a way that made them appear almost luminous. Lila sensed that he was observing more than her actions. He was observing the very essence of the connection forming in the clearing, the unspoken understanding between her and the wolf, and the silent energy that seemed to bind them all together. The forest held a hushed reverence, the usual nocturnal sounds muted as if nature itself recognized the importance of the moment. Lila slowly rose to her knees, her gaze shifting from the wolf to the man, curiosity and caution intertwining in her expression. She noticed now the subtle signs of his attentiveness, the careful way he moved, not disturbing the forest floor, and the way his eyes, though fixed on her, seemed to see beyond her form, into the very thread of energy that connected them. The wolf moved closer to her side, nudging her gently as if to remind her that the bond they shared was still fragile but growing. Lila's fingers instinctively grazed the fur along its back, feeling the pulse of its body sync with her own breath. The man's presence, though quiet, now felt less like an intrusion and more like a confirmation, a silent witness to the unfolding moment of understanding and trust. A gentle breeze passed through the clearing, rustling the leaves in a soft chorus that seemed to harmonize with the quiet rhythm of their breathing. Lila felt the air vibrate slightly, a subtle resonance that seemed to acknowledge the unseen tether linking her, the wolf, and the man together. She took a slow, deliberate breath, grounding herself in the stillness of the forest and the steadying presence of the creature at her side. The man's gaze softened just slightly, a barely perceptible shift that suggested recognition of the rare instinct and compassion that had guided her hands. Lila felt a quiet determination swell within her, an understanding that her actions, however instinctive, had set in motion something far larger than herself. The forest around them seemed to pulse in harmony with that energy, every shadow, every glint of moonlight, every whisper of leaves reinforcing the sense that this was a pivotal moment, a crossing into a new understanding that would change the night, and perhaps much more, for all three of them. The forest no longer felt like a place she had entered by chance, but like a space that had been quietly waiting for her arrival, as though every tree and shadow had been positioned long before she ever took her first step into the clearing. Lila Bennett stood slowly, her hands lifting away from the now stable wolf, which remained close to her side, its breathing calm and steady, its eyes reflecting a quiet awareness that seemed almost human in its understanding. The moonlight above shifted gently, casting pale silver across the ground, illuminating the space between her and the man who had remained silent, yet present throughout everything. He did not move closer immediately, but his gaze remained fixed on her with a level of attention that felt neither intrusive nor distant, but precise, as if measuring something unseen. Lila felt the weight of that gaze settle over her, not as pressure, but as recognition, and it stirred something deep within her that she could not name. The air itself felt charged with a stillness that was no longer uncertain, but expectant, as though the clearing had become the center of something far larger than the three beings within it. The wolf shifted slightly, pressing closer to Lila's leg, and she instinctively placed a gentle hand on its head, grounding herself in the familiar warmth that now pulsed steadily beneath her touch. The man finally stepped forward again, closing the distance by only a few feet, his movements deliberate and calm, each step measured as though he were respecting an invisible boundary that had already been established. Lila met his gaze directly for the first time without hesitation, and in that brief exchange, she felt something shift that was not visible but undeniable, a sense of acknowledgement passing between them like a silent understanding that required no words. The forest around them seemed to respond, the faint rustle of leaves quieting even further, as though the world itself was listening. The man spoke at last, his voice low and steady, carrying a tone that suggested certainty rather than explanation, and he acknowledged what had occurred here was not ordinary, not something that could be dismissed or easily understood. Lila listened carefully, her attention sharpened not by fear, but by the growing realization that whatever she had done had consequences beyond what she had imagined. She glanced once more at the wolf, noticing how it now stood with more balance, its earlier fragility replaced with a quiet strength that mirrored her own growing awareness. The man's expression remained composed, yet there was a subtle shift in his eyes, something that suggested recognition of a truth he had perhaps been searching for longer than she could know. Lila felt a faint pull in her chest, not physical but instinctive, as if something within her was responding to the presence before her in a way she had never experienced. The clearing felt smaller now, not because of confinement, but because of connection, as though invisible threads had formed between all three of them, weaving a pattern she could not yet see but could undeniably feel. The wind moved softly through the trees again, carrying with it a sense of continuation, as if the moment they were in was no longer isolated but part of a much larger unfolding. Lila remained still, aware that nothing about this encounter was ending, but rather shifting into something deeper, something that had only just begun to reveal itself beneath the quiet of the forest night. The night deepened around Lila Bennett as she remained in the clearing, the moonlight spilling across the mossy ground and creating long, silver streaks that danced with every subtle movement of the forest. Her hands rested lightly on the wolf, which now stood with a quiet strength, its amber eyes watching her with a calm attentiveness that made her chest swell with a strange mixture of pride and awe. The man had stepped closer, his presence no longer distant but comfortably near, and yet there remained a respectful space between them, as if neither wished to disturb the fragile balance that had formed. Lila noticed the way his eyes lingered on the wolf first, and then on her, the quiet understanding in his gaze communicating more than words ever could. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, carrying the earthy scent of pine and wet soil, and the clearing felt charged with an energy that was both grounding and expansive, as if the forest itself acknowledged the significance of the moment. She felt a warmth flow through her again, subtler now, steady and comforting, connecting her to the creature she had healed and to the silent observer who stood with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. The wolf moved closer to her side, nudging her gently as though encouraging her to rise fully, to face whatever was waiting beyond the edges of this quiet sanctuary. Lila inhaled deeply, feeling the cool night air fill her lungs, and she took a tentative step forward, grounding herself in the rhythm of the wolf's calm movements and the steady gaze of the man. He shifted slightly, an almost imperceptible motion that suggested recognition, approval, and a silent invitation for her to acknowledge what had already begun between them. The forest seemed to lean in with her, shadows stretching and contracting with the moonlight, leaves glimmering as though reflecting some unseen truth. Lila's eyes swept over the clearing, taking in every detail with a clarity she had never experienced before, and she realized that the quiet, steady presence beside her was more than observation. It was a connection, a tether that had been forming since the first touch of her hands on the wolf's fur. The man spoke, his voice low and even, carrying a weight of certainty without urgency, explaining that what she had accomplished was remarkable, a gift not just for the wolf, but for the very balance of the night around them. Lila absorbed each word, feeling the resonance of it in her chest, her heart sinking with the gentle rhythm of the forest and the creature she had nurtured. She glanced down at the wolf once more, noting the way it now held its head high, its stance steady and confident, as though it understood that it had been guided to safety by her own hands. The man's gaze met hers again, steady and intent, and in that quiet exchange, she felt the subtle acknowledgement that this night, this moment, had already begun to alter something fundamental in their lives. The clearing remained bathed in silver light, the air thick with expectation yet calm, and Lila realized that the trust, the bond, and the silent understanding among the three of them was no longer tentative, but firmly rooted, a quiet promise that whatever came next would be shaped by the choices and the courage that had led them here. The clearing had grown even quieter, as if the world beyond the trees had stepped back to give space to what was about to unfold. Lila Bennett stood near the center of the moonlit circle, her hands no longer touching the wolf, but hovering close enough to feel the steady warmth it now carried within its body. The creature stood beside her with a calm certainty that felt unnatural compared to the fragile state it had been in only moments before, its amber eyes reflecting the silver sky with an awareness that seemed far deeper than instinct alone. The man remained just beyond arm's reach, his presence no longer hidden in shadow but fully revealed in the pale light, his posture calm and unwavering as he studied both Lila and the wolf with quiet recognition. The air between them felt charged, not with tension, but with anticipation, as if something long dormant had finally reached the surface. Lila felt it too, a subtle pressure in her chest that rose and fell with her breathing, as though the forest itself was breathing with her. The wolf shifted slightly closer to her side, not in fear but in alignment, as though confirming a bond that had already been sealed through her actions. The man's gaze softened, and for the first time there was no distance in his expression, only acknowledgement, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment far longer than she could understand. Slowly, he stepped forward, closing the remaining space between them with deliberate care, and as he did, the energy in the clearing seemed to respond, the moonlight above intensifying in a gentle cascade of silver brilliance. Lila did not move back. Instead, she stood still, grounded by something within her that felt both new and ancient at the same time. The wolf lifted its head toward the man, and a quiet sound escaped it, not a warning but a recognition that carried meaning beyond language. The man extended his hand slightly, not toward the wolf, but toward Lila, and in that simple gesture, something within the air shifted, like the final piece of a pattern falling into place. Lila felt a sudden clarity wash over her, not spoken but deeply understood, as if fragments of her experience, the healing, the warmth, the connection, all aligned into a truth she could no longer deny. The forest responded with a gentle rise of wind, leaves shimmering like scattered light as the atmosphere around them became still yet alive with possibility. The man finally spoke her name, and in doing so, the recognition in his voice carried a weight that made the world feel smaller and larger at once. Lila realized then that this meeting had not been accidental, that the pull she had felt since stepping into the forest had been guiding her towards something far greater than a single moment of healing. The wolf pressed its shoulder lightly against her leg, steady and calm, as if affirming what she was beginning to understand. The man's presence no longer felt separate from the forest or the night, but part of a greater thread that connected all of them. Lila lifted her gaze toward him, and in that exchange, there was no longer confusion or hesitation, only recognition of something undeniable forming between them, something that had been written long before she ever stepped beneath the trees. The moonlight brightened one final time, bathing the clearing in a soft radiance that seemed to suspend time itself, and in that stillness, Lila understood that her life had already crossed into something irreversible, something that would continue far beyond this forest, guided by the bond that had silently chosen her.